Welcome back to this tour of the biblical orchard, where the fruit of the Spirit grows. Paul's list of the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians 5 is well known. In fact, many people know them by heart. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, or sometimes goodness instead, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. It's an impressive list, but I think sometimes it can sound like sort of abstract concepts or maybe attitudes that we need to develop. Maybe the ultimate self-improvement course. But that understanding doesn't really fit the image that Paul uses. Fruit of the Spirit. The fruit he's talking about is the result of the Holy Spirit's work within us, not a result of our effort. And if you think about, regular fruit trees, they don't think, man, I got to buckle down now and push out those apples. God's creative power brings that fruit out of them, really, whether they wanted to or not. So what does it look like when the Holy Spirit gets a hold of someone and starts producing fruit in their lives? Well, in this series, we're looking at biblical texts where exactly that happened. These real-life models helped to translate the fruit of the Spirit from concept to reality. Now, we started last week with Solomon relying on a mother's love to settle a dispute between two women over whose child was living and whose had died. Today, we move to joy. Now, what comes to mind when you hear the word joy? You might want to pause the video and briefly discuss that question. Well, I'm not sure what you came up with, but I think we often hear joy just as a synonym for happiness, or maybe a special thrill of some kind. And those emotions may in fact be a part of joy, but it's a deeper concept. Joy is the experience of something greater than ourselves, beyond what our five senses can sense. The deep meaning of joy was really brought out by C.S. Lewis in his autobiography, which he called Surprised by Joy. And for him, joy was a glimpse of the transcendent, of a reality beyond this normal world as we experience it. Glimpses of joy included beauty, or the miracle of life, the complexity and calibration of creation, true art, all of those things that just take us a little bit beyond daily reality, give us a glimpse of something more than this life. We might call it catching sight of God's fingerprints or God's handiwork in a special way. Well, that means that true joy is rooted in God and His promises, not in our emotions. And that kind of joy leads to a deeper satisfaction than happiness, which is wonderful but tends to be fleeting. Joy includes a certainty, an assurance of God's goodness that endures. Well, one of the great examples of joy in the Bible is Hannah, the mother of Samuel. Her story is told in 1 Samuel chapters 1 and 2. Now, Hannah was one of two wives of a man named Elkanah. The other wife was Peninnah. Peninnah had borne many children, but Hannah was barren. And you need to know that in the ancient world, women understood having children as their reason for existing. So to be barren was much more than just a disappointment or a loss. It brought stigma, a sense of failure, of tragedy, of not fulfilling one's reason for being. Worse yet, Peninnah insulted Hannah, rubbed her nose in her childlessness, and just generally annoyed her in every way. To his credit, Elkanah loved Hannah and tried to comfort her and console her. But it wasn't enough. To relieve her of her deep distress, even despair at having no children. Well, each year Elkanah would take his family to the worship shrine at Shiloh. It was an important worship site in ancient Israel. And once when they were there and Hannah had enough of Peninnah's harassment, she went to the temple in Shiloh and prayed fervently for God to give her a child. Now the text specifically notes that she prayed silently, but her lips were moving. And it tells us a lot about the state of Israel's religious life at that time, that the chief priest, Eli, saw her praying and assumed that she was drunk and just babbling. But once he learned the truth, he assured Hannah that God had heard her prayer. And hearing Eli's word, the text says that her countenance was sad no longer. In other words, she was filled with joy. Now note, she was not yet pregnant. In fact, it says that only happened in due time. And that the assurance that God was with her and had heard her was enough to bring her joy. In her distressed prayer, however, Hannah had made a bargain with God. If he gave her a son, she promised to devote that son to God's service. Now that kind of bargaining is never necessary and often a really bad idea. Not least because we humans aren't great at keeping our end of those bargains. But Hannah was as good as her word. The Lord did grant her request. She conceived and bore Samuel. And when he was weaned, she took him to Shiloh and left him there in Eli's care. And thereafter she only saw her firstborn son once a year when they went to Shiloh to sacrifice. She would make and bring him a new robe to fit him as he grew. And God later blessed her with more children, 3 more sons and 2 daughters. Still, I think it's hard for us even to imagine ourselves in Hannah's situation, to put ourselves in her shoes. I mean, God had finally taken away the soul-crushing stigma of her barrenness. I mean, can you imagine her happiness, or even more, her joy, when Samuel was born? I'm sure Elkanah felt the same way, although Peninnah may have been a little sour about it all. But just because of that, can you imagine taking your 2-year-old or 3-year-old, long-awaited firstborn son, and turning him over to an elderly man in a far distant town? I mean, in some way that must have dampened Hannah's and Elkanah's happiness. I have to think that a whole lot of tears flowed as they left Shiloh and left Samuel behind. So what in the world empowered her to do that? Well, I think it was more than the obligation of the vow she had made, that bargain with God. It was driven by the overwhelming joy of knowing God was with her and had blessed her. That joy surrounded, overwhelmed, overcame the sorrow of being separated from Samuel. And so even as she left her son there in Shiloh, she knew he was under God's care because she had this deep, abiding joy that God had granted her. In fact, that profound joy drove Hannah to break out in song, even after she had left Samuel behind. Her song is in 1 Samuel chapter 2, and it foreshadows Mary's Magnificat that we read in Luke chapter 1. Both songs proclaim God's care for the downtrodden, the needy, the oppressed, those who get the short end of the stick in this world. And verse 6 of Hannah's song is especially apt. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many children is forlorn. Tables have been turned. And yet that isn't the point of the song. Hannah isn't just now trying to rub Peninnah's nose in the fact that she's finally had children. Hannah isn't just giving as good as she got, but rather her song expresses the awesome joy of trusting God in the midst and despite life's hard times. It's the rock-solid reassurance of knowing God is real and that God is for me. Well, joy like that is much more than mere happiness. It endures, and it sustains us even through the dark valleys of life, even through the valley of the shadow of death. It's rooted in the reality of God's steadfast love, not our experience. It's fruit grown within us by the Holy Spirit to bless us, to buoy us up, and to sustain us in enduring joy. So enjoy some discussion now of where God has blessed you in your life with glimpses and the experience of joy.